Welcome back. Now let's revise invoice and other documents. See, the basic understanding regarding invoice and other documents is that these documents are required by the trade at every given step. What happens if you don't comply with invoice and other documents? Some places where there is a specific penalty, section 122 penalty may apply, or in other cases a general penalty under section 125 may apply, and that's why it is important for the trade, that is the registered person, to maintain documents which are mentioned in the law. The first one is section 31. It talks about time limit to issue invoice. We have dealt with section 31 at time of supply chapter. We had seen that when it comes to service industry, the time limit to issue invoice is 30 days from the date of provision of service or date of completion of service. 30 days gets replaced by 45 days for banks, financial institution, insurance companies. Then you had also seen something related to goods, where if the supply involves movement, you have to issue the invoice on or before the date of removal. If it does not involve movement, on or before the date of making available. And sale on approval, acceptance, or 6 months from the date of removal. Same way we had it for continuous supply of goods and continuous supply of service. That particular discussion is there in section 31, which is already dealt in time of supply. Then comes, what are the informations which are required to be mentioned on a invoice? You have various informations. One important thing is name and address of the recipient. It is required only if value is more than or equal to 50,000. But there are some special cases like online money gaming or supply through or by e-commerce operator. Then in that case, it is mandatory to mention the state. Plus, that state which you have mentioned is deemed to be an address. Why state is very important in these cases? So that the tax correctly flows to the state which is eligible for that particular taxation benefit. Then HSN 0 to 5 crores in preceding financial year. Then in that case, you can mention 4 digit for B2B, and for B2C transactions it is optional. And when it comes to more than 5 crores, 6 digit is mandatory, whether it's B2C or B2B, it doesn't matter. Then some important details like description, taxable value, total value, signature, digital signature, QR code which is required for e-invoicing. All these are the details which are required to be mentioned on an invoice. Then comes a topic, revised invoice. Now what's the speciality of revised invoice? See, revised invoice basically deals with a particular scenario. Say suppose I was liable to register on 1/7/2024 and I apply for registration on 25/7/2024. Have I applied within 30 days from the date when I was liable to register? The answer is yes. So he is a good person. What will be the effective date? Effective date will be date when he was liable to register. But tell me one thing, when will he get registration later on? So he got registration on 4/8. Now here when he got registration, he'll get a GST number. Now when he gets a GST number, this GST number, there is a time lag between these two. Now as there is a time lag between these two, all invoices issued between the effective date and till the grant of registration can be revised within 1 month from the date of grant of registration. That is what is provided in the law. Now remember one thing, that this is possible only when there is a difference between effective date and grant date. All these invoices can be revised by you, and what's the benefit? When you revise all these invoices, the recipient will be able to claim ITC. However, the law clearly mentions that the revised invoice is completely optional. It is left to the option of the taxpayer. If he wants to issue revised invoice, well and good. If he does not want to issue, then also there is no problem. Now, what if I apply after 30 days? Say suppose I apply after 30 days, then what will be the effective date of my registration? If I apply after 30 days, then the effective date of registration will be date of grant. Now if the effective date of registration is date of grant, there is no difference between effective date and grant date. Revised invoice will not be permitted. So if you apply after 30 days, there are two indirect punishments. One, you cannot avail ITC on your purchases from liable date till grant. Second, you will not be able to pass on the ITC to your customer. He will also not be able to claim ITC on those invoices because you have applied after 30 days. So two indirect punishments for applying after 30 days. So should we apply within 30 days? The answer is yes. Now let's see what all can be revised, and should you issue separate invoices or consolidated invoices. Say suppose it's a B2B transaction. For GST, what is B2B? Registered person to registered person. So all B2B transactions, the law very clearly says that whether it is inter or intra, you have to issue separate revised invoices. In fact, you will issue separate revised invoice so that your recipient can avail ITC. In fact, if your recipient is happy, you will also be happy. B2C. Now B2C is the consumer, that is registered person to unregistered person. Is he worried about ITC? No, he is not at all worried about ITC. So can I consolidate? Yes. For all B2C transaction, you can issue, it's all optional, but you can issue one revised invoice and keep it with yourself. But if it is interstate and more than 2.5 lakh, then a separate revised invoice is required to be issued. Up to 2.5 lakh or intrastate any amount, you can issue consolidated revised invoice. Only one transaction which government wants to track: who is this consumer who is coming to other state, purchasing for more than 2.5 lakh. Give his details separately. That's what government wants to track. Now this 2.5 lakh limit is 1 lakh for returns chapter, because returns reporting is changed to 1 lakh. Don't forget that this 2.5 lakh remains as it is. What has changed is returns chapter reporting. There they have made it more than 1 lakh. Here they have not amended it. Maybe in future they will do it. Then the next document is consolidated tax invoice. See, for a small stationery shop who is a registered person, it is not practically possible to issue invoices every transaction. Say suppose a person comes to buy a sharpener, comes to buy a geometry box. Practically it's not possible to issue invoice for each and every transaction. So government has given an option. If three conditions are getting satisfied: first one, recipient is unregistered person; second, value is less than 200; and third, recipient does not require a invoice. If these three conditions are satisfied, then all such transactions can be consolidated. But this consolidated tax invoice is not applicable for multiplex screen, and this consolidated tax invoice will be done on a per day basis. So all the transactions throughout that day, you will issue one consolidated tax invoice. Then comes a topic, bill of supply. Now bill of supply is issued by two persons: composition dealers. Composition dealers because they cannot issue a tax invoice. Reason? They cannot collect tax from customers. And the second one is registered person supplying exempted goods or exempted services. Be very careful. Registered person supplying exempted goods or exempted services. If it's an unregistered person, he will not come into the GST law. There is no question of issue of any document. It's only for a registered person who is supplying exempted goods or services. Be very careful on this. But say suppose there is a doctor who is only providing exempt service. He is not liable to register. Should he issue bill of supply? No. Okay. Then invoice cum bill of supply is only when you are supplying to unregistered person. This was to help supermarkets. See what happens in supermarkets. You purchase a variety of goods. Now some will be exempt, some will be taxable. Now for exempt, issuing bill of supply. For taxable, issuing invoice. Practically, it is very difficult, and hence government came up with a new document called as invoice cum bill of supply, where a person supplying both taxable as well as exempted goods can issue a combination which is invoice cum bill of supply. Okay, then you have receipt voucher. When do you issue a receipt voucher? See, whenever you receive an advance, you have to issue a receipt voucher as a supplier, acknowledging that you have received an advance. Now, the law also says, say suppose you don't know the GST rate applicable, then you will use 18%. Say suppose you don't know whether it is inter or intra, then you will use inter. But which is better, receipt voucher or invoice? Now I'll just come to you after I discuss refund voucher. See, refund voucher is when the person is supplier is refunding the advance received. See, sometimes it so happens that the recipient does not require the service or supply of goods and he asks for a refund, and at that point of time you give him the refund. At the time of refunding, you have to issue a refund voucher. Now the question is, when you are issuing refund voucher, you will refund the tax also to him. Can you claim that from government? Yes. Refund voucher, you can claim it back from government, but there is one condition. You will have to file a separate refund application. Sir, obviously it's difficult. Yeah, separate refund application to be filed, then getting the money back from government is slightly tricky. But what about a case where I tell you that instead of issuing receipt voucher, you can issue invoice, and then instead of issuing refund voucher, you can issue one credit note. And credit note allows self-adjustment. Self-adjustment meaning I can adjust the taxes myself. So if I am adjusting the taxes myself, then in that case, good for me, very good for me, because refund voucher I will have to go to department to seek a refund, but invoice and credit note, self-adjustment is possible. So refund voucher is much better only when I am sure that I want to apply for a refund application. Otherwise, invoice and credit note combination is considered to be the best. Okay. Payment voucher. Who issues payment voucher, sir? Payment voucher is issued by the recipient, but only when it is a case of RCM. So payment voucher will be issued only when it is a case of reverse charge mechanism. If it's a forward charge case, there is no question of issuing payment voucher. In fact, this is the only document which is issued by the recipient. Now, there can be two cases. RCM, supplier is registered. Now, if the supplier is registered, then supplier will issue invoice. If the supplier is unregistered, then recipient has to issue a self-invoice. Is it, sir? Yes. Recipient has to issue a self-invoice. But be careful. He has to issue a self-invoice only when it is a case covered by RCM and not otherwise. Okay. Then, delivery challan. Whenever there is movement of goods and at that point of time you cannot issue an invoice, then the law says let the goods not move without any document, move it with a delivery challan. So delivery challan is to make sure that there is movement, and that movement is accompanied with a document, like job work, when you send it for job work, or when you send it for sale on approval basis, or when you send the goods for other than supply. Other than supply can be from one branch to another branch within same registration, that is principal place to another additional place, one additional place to another additional place, because it would be under the same registration. Supply of liquid gas, where the quantity to be billed is not known at the time of dispatch. Goods being moved in CKD, SKD, completely knocked down or semi knocked down. Big machines, windmills are transported in this form. Okay, then there are some special provisions like banks. Banks have an option. Banks can issue one invoice per customer per month. Plus, there is one more thing. Between distinct persons, they can issue one invoice per quarter. This between distinct person is available to banks, financial institutions, telecom companies, insurance companies. This gives a lot of ease to distinct person, because between banks they'll keep taking services every day. Like Bangalore branch will keep taking services from Mumbai branch. That doesn't mean you have to issue invoice immediately. You can issue invoice once in a quarter. Then GTA. GTA basically has to mention some additional documents, because GTA the possibility of GTA being involved in tax evasion is very high. So that's the reason government is a bit careful on GTA, saying GTA you have to issue some additional documents, like additional details have to be mentioned, like consignor, consignee, origin of the goods, destination of the goods, gross weight, carriage, vehicle number, person liable to pay tax under RCM. So all these details have to be mentioned. Okay, transportation of passengers, ticket is deemed to be an invoice, and the law very clearly says ticket in any form is deemed to be an invoice. Then talking about multiplex screen also can issue an electronic ticket, and that electronic ticket will be regarded as a invoice even if it doesn't contain the name of the recipient. Okay, then comes the most important document, debit note, credit note. Now, why do you issue a debit note? Debit note has two purposes. First of all, both the documents are only issued by the supplier. It is not issued by recipient, both are issued by supplier. Debit note is to increase tax or increase value. Say suppose you have charged lower tax on the invoice, or you have charged lower value on the invoice. Then if you want to increase it, you cannot revise an invoice, so you will issue a debit note. And the moment you issue a debit note, you will be able to increase the price, increase the tax, and consequently the recipient will be eligible to take ITC, because as he can take ITC on invoice, the recipient can also take ITC on debit note. Let's see, both invoice and debit note, who issues? It is issued by the supplier. Whenever supplier issues, what happens? Supplier's output will increase. And who receives it? Received by recipient, and his ITC will increase. Here you have to mention recipient's ITC will increase, because the moment supplier's output is increasing, the recipient will get corresponding ITC. Now be careful about one thing. Whenever the question mentions issued, do the treatment in output, because it is from the angle of a supplier. Whenever it says received, do the treatment from ITC angle. And read the question properly to see whether I am a buyer or a seller, whether I am purchasing or selling. whether I am doing a inward supply or outward supply, and depending on that you will anyways get to know whether you should do the treatment on output or in ITC. But debit note always increases. It either increases the output or increases the ITC for one person. For the other person it will be opposite. But when we are computing in the exam, we will be doing it for one person. Now you check whether you are doing from the angle of supplier or whether you are doing it from the angle of recipient. Be careful on this. Credit note. What is the purpose to issue credit note? Sales return, to reduce tax, to reduce value, or if there has been a deficient supply of goods or services. Credit note will always reduce. So, issued by supplier, and the moment supplier issues, supplier's output will reduce. Who receives it? It is received by the recipient, and recipient's ITC will also get reduced. Okay. Is there a last date to issue debit note? No. Debit note does not have a last date. Is there a last date to issue credit note? The answer is yes. The last date to issue credit note is 30th November after the financial year or date of filing annual return, whichever is earlier. You have seen this earlier as well. This was also the time limit to avail ITC. The same one is applicable even for time limit to issue credit note. Okay. Then coming to e-invoicing. Now, e-invoicing. See, e-invoicing does not mean you go to the government portal and raise an invoice. You can raise the invoice with the software or manual which you have been doing. Then you have to send this data to a government portal which is called as IRP, Invoice Registration Portal. Once you send the data to the Invoice Registration Portal, this will give you a IRN, Invoice Reference Number. You print this on the invoice and it will be embedded in a QR code. This becomes a e-invoice. That's it. Yes. Okay. It's applicable for B2B transactions and export transactions. What about other B2C transactions? No. Only for B2B, registered to registered or export transaction. Though it says e-invoice, but it is applicable for 3 documents: invoice, debit note, credit note. But it has to be a B2B transaction or a export transaction. Plus, who is required to issue e-invoice? Any person whose preceding financial year turnover starting from 17-18 for any preceding financial year exceeds 5 crores. So if in any of the preceding financial year starting from 17-18, if your turnover was more than 5 crore, then you are required to issue e-invoice. So e-invoice is required whenever in any preceding financial year starting from 17-18, the turnover of the person, aggregate turnover, was more than 5 crore. Now, there are some exceptions. Cases where e-invoice is not required. SEZ unit not required. Careful. SEZ developer, are they required? Yes, they are required to issue e-invoice. Banks and financial institutions, insurance companies, GTA, a person providing transportation of passenger service, multiplex screen, government or local authority. And multiplex screen, it talks about admission, entry fee. It doesn't talk about anything else for other things. Now, the question is, if an entity is covered here, will they have to issue e-invoice for other transactions which they do, or are they given a blanket exemption? For instance, bank provides banking services. It also sells gold bullion, gold biscuit. It also sells silver bullion, silver biscuit. So whether bank is required to issue e-invoice for such cases? CBIC has clarified that if banks are mentioned in the exception, banks are mentioned in the exception for a whole, and for any transaction they will not be required to issue e-invoice, because once they are covered in this exception, they are covered as an entity as a whole. Then any transaction by them, no need of e-invoice. Clear with this? Okay. Now just beware, a e-invoice can be cancelled within 24 hours. Any amendment is not permitted. There is no need to have digital signature or signature, not required. No need to create 3 copies, original for recipient, duplicate for transporter, triplicate for supplier, because all this information is already with government portal, so nothing else is required in e-invoicing. In fact, CBIC has also clarified that while there is movement of goods, you can carry goods without physical copy of e-invoice. If you have e-invoice on mobile phone, that is sufficient, because it's a machine readable document. The basic purpose is that the officer, once he is scanning, or anyone once he is scanning, he should get to know whether it's a fake invoice or a real invoice. That's the main aim. Okay, then coming to the last one, dynamic QR code. Now basically dynamic QR code is required for B2C invoice. What's the speciality of dynamic QR code? You can scan. The moment you scan, you can pay by entering PIN. You don't have to enter the amount. Dynamic QR code vis-a-vis static QR code. Static QR code, you have to enter the amount. Once you scan, you have to enter the amount. But dynamic QR code is different every time. Dynamic QR code is generated every time a transaction is conducted. You can simply scan and pay without entering the amount. So, sir, who is required to have this? See, this has to be printed on every B2C invoice. That's what the law said. Who is required to do it? Aggregate turnover in any financial year. Careful, the wordings is any financial year. Starting from 17-18 exceeds 500 crores. Never has the limit been reduced. Then industry had some questions whether dynamic QR code is required for this transaction, that transaction, and so CBIC has given various clarifications. Let's start. First, exports. Will it be required for exports? CBIC clarified no, not required, because export is as good as a B2B transaction, because you are issuing e-invoice. So treating it as a B2B transaction, no need to issue e-invoice for exports. Then our industry did not keep quiet. They said, what if recipient is located outside India and place of supply is in India? See, if recipient is outside India, place of supply is in India, it is not regarded as an export, because to become an export, place of supply should be outside India. Then CBIC was like, is it required? Then they said no, because see, if the recipient is outside India, do you think he will scan and pay? No, obviously the technology is good, but it's not so good that at present you are converting forex into INR at that particular point of time, and again a dynamic one gets generated at that point of time. Obviously no. And hence CBIC clarified that it is done by RBI approved methods. There is no question of dynamic QR code. What about UIN holders? UIN holders, yes, when you are supplying to UIN holders, UN or embassy who have a unique identity number, for them they are regarded as unregistered person. Having a UIN, you are not a registered person. Only GSTIN is a registered person. UIN holders are not regarded as registered persons. Hence, dynamic QR code is required for supplies made to them. Prepaid order, will dynamic QR code be required? CBIC said no, because if the cross reference is available, that is sufficient. The real reason is, as it is already paid, what will you do with the dynamic QR code? But don't write this, you have to write the clarification given by CBIC. If cross reference of the invoice and the payment is available on the invoice, it is deemed to have been complied with the provisions of dynamic QR code. Then what should be there in dynamic QR code. What all information should be captured and shown to the consumer who is scanning this dynamic QR code? CBIC said invoice number, invoice amount, bank details, UPI, GST breakup, plus it should be such that a person can scan and pay. Now industry had some issues. Invoice number. Now when you go to supermarket or shopper stop, when you want to make a payment, first payment will happen, then invoice will be generated. That means invoice number, can they show it to you upfront? Because invoice is generated only after you make the payment. CBIC said, okay, instead of invoice, if order ID is displayed or reference number is displayed, that is also sufficient. Because in some cases the invoice number gets generated after making payment. In that case, how do I show the invoice number beforehand to the customer when it is actually not available? Then invoice amount. Now say suppose the invoice amount is 100, but there is some money of the person which is already there with the seller. 40 rupees was already there, or some token, some gift voucher, something is used, and you have to pay only 60. The question was, dynamic QR code should be for 100 or 60, because here they mentioned invoice amount. CBIC clarified that only for the remaining amount, because the purpose of dynamic QR code is that you are able to scan and pay, but the cross reference should be provided on the invoice, meaning the details should be provided on the invoice regarding that 40 rupees, and the transaction details should be captured. Bank details, UPI. Say suppose bank is already linked to UPI, same bank. Should you give both? CBIC said may not be required. So if bank details are linked to UPI, then may not be required. Bank details may not be required. So whose UPI ID? Because CBIC said supplier UPI ID. But what happens in case of Amazon? That is supplied through e-commerce operator. Do you know that Amazon collects the money on behalf of the suppliers, cuts the commission, cuts any deduction, and then pays the balance to the suppliers? So the question is, can Amazon's UPI ID be mentioned instead of supplier? First, when CBIC issued, they said no. Then Amazon said, hey, I am collecting payment. How can you say no? Finally, they changed the circular and they amended this point, saying that Amazon's UPI ID will also be allowed. There will not be any difficulty. Reason being, Amazon is collecting payment on behalf of the suppliers. Clear with this? Yes? Okay. Then there are some exceptions. First, banking company, no need to issue in dynamic QR code. Insurance company, GTA, passenger transport service, and then you have OIDAR, online information database access retrieval services from outside India to a person in India. For them also, no need to issue dynamic QR code. So this was about invoice and other documents. See you all in the next video.